Starting when I was a child, it was my job to run into the shop or the restaurant or school to make sure there was a chair with arms or a railing on the staircase. I'm not sure how old I was when this duty was bestowed upon me. I just always remember doing it. It was just what was done in my family. As I aged into an eye-rolling preteen and a sullen and angry teenager, I started to resent that I didn't have a normal family. No one else I knew had to do this. My friends went on fun vacations and played sports with their parents. My mother and grandmother were my parents. A lot was expected of me. I took care of my brother when my parents were unable to, even though he was only a year younger. We were latchkey kids. I was responsible for a lot of chores, too. My grandmother ran the house and worked full-time, while my mother spent much of her time in bed. My mother loved the summers she spent at her grandparents' farm. This is where she contracted polio. She would end up at the University of Michigan Medical Center in the polio unit, eventually paralyzed from the neck down. A now ancient contraption called an iron lung sat outside her room, just in case she couldn't breathe on her own. Fortunately, she never needed it, as her muscle strength would improve the following months and years. But her growth was stunted, and she only recovered 30% of her muscle capacity. For the years that followed, her parents were told by the doctors that she would never walk, never survive, never go to school, never drive, never get married, never have children. One by one, she proved them wrong. She eventually got her master's degree and taught middle school English. She managed to do all of this despite never having any accommodations given to her. When she asked the staff at her 3-story high school if she could have a couple minutes extra for passing in the hallway to get to her classrooms, they said no, that wouldn't be fair to the other students. When she got a teaching job, it was expected that teachers stand in front of the classroom and monitor halls during passing time the whole day. This took a toll on her energy, her joints, her muscles, but she adapted, somehow persevered. In the summers, I would travel with my grandmother to visit family or see the sights in Michigan. My mother wasn't crazy about leaving home, I think mostly because she might not be able to get into a bathroom or would have to climb a flight of stairs. My brother would stay home and help her. Whenever my mother would go out, we would go to the same places where we already knew the accessibility. She learned how to urinate straddling the toilet, something I never knew until I used a stall next to her when I was a teenager. My mother's body was deformed with severe scoliosis to her spine and atrophied muscles. She only lasted 13 years in teaching until her body just couldn't take the constant standing, and her fatigued muscles led to more falls. She would later read about something called post-polio syndrome, where the muscle strength that had returned after paralysis would start to progressively deteriorate. She could no longer climb stairs. We had to make a step for her to get into the car and up curbs. She could still drive, but had to manually lift her leg from the accelerator to the brake. It was sometimes an adventure to ride in the car with her. Unfortunately, she had to go it alone with her weakened body, as doctors were split on whether post-polio was even a thing. And most doctors trained in the past 50 years don't know much about polio. Then in 1990, the American with Disabilities Act was passed by Congress. Accessibility didn't happen overnight, but over the years since, the changes have been monumental. Handicapped bathrooms, curb cuts, and parking places appeared. My mother got hand controls for the car and a scooter to get around in. Almost overnight, she went from hardly being able to walk anywhere to going nearly everywhere. Instead of sending her postcards from our travels, we have tons of pictures of the back of Mom blazing ahead of us onto her next adventure. Thank you.
Judith Heumann, in her memoir written with Kristen Joyner, writes about her life and her career as a disability rights activist. Ms. Heumann contracted polio when she was about 18 months old. She was the only child of German Jews who escaped Germany shortly before the Holocaust, an experience that taught them that every person has value. Judith played with the kids in her neighborhood. Fortunately, her friends lived on the same side of the block, or she wouldn't have been able to push her chair to them because, as she put it, the curb may as well have been the Great Wall of China. But if she pushed her chair to a friend's house and then hollered out to see if she could come play, and then her friend pushed her chair to their friend Mary's house, and the girls and some other kids played together, Judy remembers, it didn't occur to me to think it unusual that I joined in all the kids' games in my wheelchair, because there was never a question of whether or not I would play too. We all figured out a way for me to do what everyone else was doing. Even when we jumped rope or roller skated, we figured it out. We'd put roller skates over my shoes, and I would pretend to be skating in my chair, or I'd turn the rope for the jumpers, or play in some other way. I didn't know anything different. And now I know that this was the way it was because we were kids, and kids are problem solvers. But it taught me at a very early age that most things are possible when you assume problems can be solved. All went well until Judy's mom took her to register for kindergarten when she was 5. And the school said that she was a fire hazard. And they couldn't possibly take her. And education was not important or even an option. But her mother, a Holocaust survivor, refused that option. She tried a Jewish yeshiva, a day school, who said that if she learned enough Hebrew, they'd take her. And so her mom found her a Hebrew teacher, only to realize when she went to enroll her the next year that that was just an obstacle the principal assumed she would never meet. When she should have been in first grade, the Board of Education sent a tutor to her home for a whopping 2.5 hours a week with no homework. It was after-school programs that her mother took her to that gave her a chance to socialize with other kids. Hebrew school, scouts, piano lessons. It was sometimes awkward to carry her up the stairs or to have to go around the back to get into the building, but they made it work. Eventually, she got into a classroom for disabled kids of all ages in one classroom where they didn't learn a whole lot and had an hour of rest time every day, even for the 17-year-olds. But like her experience with the kids in her neighborhood, Judy learned that kids working together can make anything possible. She went to summer camp with other disabled kids and got to have the normal kid experiences of being away from your parents, of having crushes and kissing boys, and further learning about disability culture. Eventually, she got into college, and she knew she wanted to become a teacher. She had to say that she wanted to become a speech pathologist because they would only pay for disabled students to do things that other disabled students had proved that they could do. So she got a minor in education and majored in speech pathology. But then she passed all of her teaching exams, and she applied to be a second grade teacher, and you had to pass the hurdle of your teaching exams and then a medical exam, which was designed to make sure you didn't have any communicable diseases. Did they check her for communicable diseases? No. That doctor asked her if she could walk, asked her if she'd ever been able to walk, asked her how she used the bathroom. And then eventually, after 2.5 hours of very pointed questions, she got a letter in the mail that determined she was not physically capable of teaching second graders. She did what you do when you've been discriminated against. Who do you call? Who do you call? Okay, you gotta figure out when this was, okay? We're talking like 1969. You call the ACLU, right? So she called the ACLU. She'd had this in her back pocket for a while. She's like, well, you know, I can call the ACLU. And the ACLU at first refused to take her case because they said you were denied your license for medical reasons, which is not discrimination. And I think that was probably the event that made Judith Newman want to fight for civil rights for disabled people. She taught for a couple of years, and then she worked in Washington, D.C. for legislators for a couple of years, and then she co-founded a group called Disabled in Action. And she worked together with folks with all types of disabilities because you know that you have to work together with other folks who have different problems but the same big issue. And the group discovered something that some really smart legislative aides had inserted into a piece of legislation that was going to be up for discussion, and it was called Section 504. And Section 504 says, no otherwise qualified person with a disability in the United States, as defined by Section da-da-da-da, shall solely by reason of his or her disability be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination in any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Somebody knew what they were doing. And that piece of legislation languished for a really long time. And a bunch of government officials worked really hard to soften that language, to shift that language, to change that language, going so far as to say, well, you know, if there are some colleges that disabled students can attend, we don't need to let them attend every college. Separate but equal is fine, right? How did separate but equal work? Not really well. And so Newman was part of an organized effort where they knew that they needed to get the media on their side, they needed to get popular opinion on their side. And so a group of disabled folks came together, folks who were blind or deaf or used wheelchairs, and they occupied 5 federal offices around the country. Now, if you are a person who uses a wheelchair because you are paralyzed, sleeping on an office floor is not an easy thing to do. You have to have someone come and turn you every few hours so you don't get pressure sores. But they worked with other civil rights organizations, and people helped each other. Folks who were blind or deaf or used wheelchairs or were paralyzed helped each other with some of these activities that were involved in being in this federal building. The other 4 of them crashed after anywhere from 2 days to a week, but the one in Berkeley hung on for at least 3 weeks. Unions and gay and lesbian groups and the Black Panthers brought in food, and they brought in hygiene supplies, and they sent folks to help people wash their hair. When the government cut off phone lines so they couldn't communicate with the outside world, well, hey, we have deaf folks and we have windows, and there are people out there who can read sign language and can get our messages across. And once attention was being paid, the group sent folks to Washington, D.C. to advocate for the bill to be passed as is. No separate but equal, no only in these conditions. And the machinists' union paid their travel expenses, including renting a Ryder moving van to transport a bunch of wheelchair-using folks in the dark without tie-downs because there was no public transportation in DC that was accessible. And when the bill was eventually signed into law, which it finally was, that bill is what eventually paved the way for the Americans with Disabilities Act. That bill and those people advocating are why we have ramps on public buildings. They are why we have Braille signs on ATM machines, and why folks with disabilities can have accommodations and are allowed to work almost anywhere. And people like my Aunt Arnell, who also contracted polio, though her, when she was an older teen, worked locally on local issues. I was really proud when I found out that she was one of the folks who got Nordstrom's and Macy's to offer handicapped accessible fitting rooms. It used to be that if you were in a wheelchair, you couldn't get into a fitting room and you couldn't try on clothes, and there were no clothes being ordered off the internet, so you were kind of stuck. But Aunt Arnell was a hospital administrator in McMinnville, and she had a professional job and needed professional clothing, and she needed a place to try on that clothing. There are so many ways that the United States is advanced in rights for folks with disabilities. When I was in Hungary and Romania in 2008, taking a Unitarian Universalist youth group over there, I was shocked to realize that only one of the subway stations in Budapest was accessible to folks in wheelchairs. Now, think about it for a second. How much good does it do if one station is accessible? You could take a scenic ride around the route, I suppose, but it sure as heck doesn't get you anywhere you need to go. We have very different ideas about what constitutes a good quality of life. In Hungary, it is assumed that each family will take care of their own people. No one lives in nursing homes because everyone is cared for by family members. And the woman I stayed with had taken care of her own mother for 8 months until she died. But her mother and her mother's hospital bed were brought into her 4th floor apartment in the little tiny elevator, and she never left again because she couldn't. Community care, individual rights. Neither one of them are bad things. But I am, to some extent, really grateful that we have a belief that it is important for people to be able to live independent lives if they want to. What an amazing place it would be if we had an ethos of both care and independence. If we believe that folks with disabilities should be given full, independent lives and that healthcare was a given. Obamacare, or the Affordable Health Care Act, was a godsend to folks with disabilities who, before its rules, often couldn't get health insurance because they could be denied because they had a pre-existing condition. But what would it mean if everyone had access to universal health care? Disability is, in a sense, one of the most interesting civil rights for a variety of reasons. Your race is pretty much consistent throughout your life. Gender and sexual orientation are a little more fluid, but still, at some point, most of us have an idea who we are. But disability is something that can happen to anyone at any time. Yeah. Only one 1 in 4 Americans has a disability. That's 26% of the population. But by the time folks are over 65, it goes up to 2 in 5. Sometimes folks say that they are temporarily abled because they realize that there is no guarantee that their current ability to walk or see or hear will last their whole lives. It sure didn't for my mom. Ms. Human notes that disability is a natural aspect of the human condition. As people live longer, as we fight more wars, as medical care continues to improve, more and more people who might have died in an earlier era will live. And maybe they'll live with a disability. We should accept it, plan for it, and build our society around it. One of the goals of the Board of Trustees at this church this year is to work on accessibility at the church. We mean that broadly, from turning on the closed captioning on Zoom to finding a way for the choir to sing that doesn't involve having to get up all of these stairs, to making our restrooms more friendly for trans and non-binary folks. We also want to work on racial justice and make sure that we aren't accidentally excluding people because we don't know what we're doing wrong. I feel like my unofficial theme this year is when we know better, and you're listening, I love that. There is a Unitarian Universalist minister, the Reverend Teresa Ninan Soto, who serves our congregation in Berkeley. Reverend Soto is a Puerto Rican non-binary person who lives with cerebral palsy. They write beautiful poetry, and they called on the denomination to change our language to not be ableist in the metaphors we use. I was blind, but now I see. Keep on walking forward, standing on the side of love. Now, sometimes metaphors are important. They help us make sense of things. But Reverend Soto points out to us that for a person who cannot walk or cannot stand or cannot see, that songs or sermon illustrations or even justice movements that rely on these metaphors leave people out. And therefore, the UUA changed the name of our national justice movement to Side with Love, instead of standing on the side of love. Because when we know better, like Judith Human says, it is true that people with disabilities continue to face challenges. Disabled people are twice as likely to be unemployed as non-disabled people. There is no dependable financial source for personal assistance that we need to be able to live independently. We are still stigmatized and regularly encounter discrimination and people assuming that we are less qualified or are going to be burdensome in some way. And she writes, to confront these issues and move forward, we have to ask, what is our vision for society? Do we want our communities to be the kind of neighborhoods and cities where our loved ones can choose to stay in their communities as they age? Where if an accident happened to one of us or to one of our children, we would be able to continue living in our community, going to our same school and working our same job. We need to accept our humanity and design our world around it. To use universal design, support personal assistance, change how we hire. We can design our cities and our societies in a way that fosters belonging and community rather than segregation and isolation. We can move from saying and thinking that it can't happen to saying that it can happen, from being naysayers to being problem solvers, like kids. Reverend Teresa Ninan Soto writes a poem called We Hold Hope Close, and this is what I am closing with today. In this community, we hold hope close. We don't always know what comes next, but that cannot dissuade us. We don't always know just what to do, but that will not mean that we are lost in the wilderness. We rely on the certainty beneath, the foundations of our values and ethics. We are the people who return to love like a north star and to the truth that we are greater together than we are alone. Our hope does not live in some glimmer of an indistinct future. Rather, we know the way to the world of which we dream. And by covenant and the movement forward of one right action and the next, we know that one day we will arrive at home. May it be so, my friends. Blessed be.